As a debater, you need to respond to the arguments presented by the other team. Let's look at the various different ways to respond to an argument. Every argument made by the opposing team requires a response from you. The type of response and the amount of time you spend on your responses will vary from speech to speech. The most important strategy is to listen. Listen to your opponent's speeches and capture all of their arguments on your notes or your flow. A flow is the name we give to the system of note-taking during a debate round, and we'll cover that in a separate video. For now, the most important thing to remember is that if your opponent makes, let's say, 6 different arguments during his or her speech, you need to respond to all 6 of them. So let's call these arguments 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6. How will you and your partner respond to these arguments? That's called defense. And then how will you add your own new arguments to the round, which is called offense? This video shows you a variety of options throughout the debate round to get you started. First, let's talk about the 2 least desirable ways to respond to an argument, and that's not to respond at all. We call these 2 ways dropping and kicking. We'll start with dropping an argument because it's the last thing you would ever want to do in a debate round. Dropping an argument means that you don't discuss it at all, either because you forgot to or because you didn't have any good answers. In the world of debate, dropping an argument is really bad because everyone in the room should assume that you dropped it because either you agree with the opposing team or you aren't a good enough debater to keep your speech organized. In either case, you can lose an entire debate round just for dropping one argument. There's no way you can look at a judge and say, hey, even though we totally didn't answer that argument, we had really good answers in our mind. Even more importantly, you can't drop an argument in one speech and then somehow expect to revive it in the next speech. So if the 2AC drops an argument, it's done, kaput, finito, and the team should not have the opportunity to suddenly start talking about it in a later speech, because by then it's too late and the opposing team doesn't have enough speeches to adequately respond to that argument. So in review, if you forgot to talk about an argument in your speech that the opposing team talked about in their speech, you've dropped an argument and you probably won't win. Now let's go on to our next type of answer, kicking arguments. Kicking is like dropping in that you stop talking about an argument, but unlike dropping an argument, kicking means that you strategically decide to lose an argument. Now that might not make much sense at first, but in the world of negative teams, it makes perfect sense. Use the 1NC to make 7 or 8 arguments, then use the remaining speeches to drop the arguments you clearly aren't winning, in favor of going for the argument you might, could, or should win. This strategy gives you more time to do the work you need to do to win with your remaining arguments. But before you just start kicking arguments, there are 3 things you should know. First, you have to explain to the judge and the other team that you are kicking the argument. It sounds a little like this. Let's move on to the next argument, which is the economy. We claimed in our previous speech that the affirmative plan would lead to mass bankruptcy. The affirmative team had some pretty good evidence that it wouldn't, so we are no longer pursuing this argument so that we can focus on our remaining arguments. Now, you might also want to take a few seconds to explain why the argument wasn't too important in the first place. For example, you could add, the issue of mass bankruptcy may or may not occur, but the overall economic impact of the affirmative plan would still be devastating. So let's move on to that argument. Notice how kicking is different than dropping. When you kick an argument, you aren't going to win on that argument, but you aren't going to lose because of it either, especially if you are on the negative team. And that brings us to the second point about kicking argument. The affirmative team cannot kick arguments that are critical to its own plan, which means any argument. If you ever see an affirmative team try to kick its own arguments, ask yourself whether the plan originally proposed by the affirmative could still function as advertised without that argument. If they're dropping one of their own arguments, they're dropping a burden of proof. The negative team has more freedom to kick its own arguments. If, for example, the negative team argues that the affirmative plan will cause 3 bad things to happen, then even if the negative team agrees that by the end of the round that only one of those bad things will happen, then one thing might still be bad enough to outweigh and all the remaining benefits of the affirmative plan. In summary, dropping arguments is always bad. And kicking arguments is not always bad, but kick arguments must be strategic. So never kick an argument unless you are sure it means you can spend more time winning better arguments. So let's move on to other ways to respond to an argument: answering, extending, and turning. And in order to show how these work, let's focus on the current resolution. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially curtail its domestic surveillance. So let's put argument 1 back on the board. We'll say that the premise of argument 1 is that banning warrantless wiretaps will result in an increase in unchecked terrorist activity. Now, in order to demonstrate how this might be true, the negative team would have to break down the argument into a few smaller arguments. Specifically, they would have to say that A, warrantless wiretaps are the primary tool used by the government, B, that warrantless wiretaps had led to the arrest of 34 suspected terrorists in the past 2 years, and C, requiring warrants slows down the process and allows more suspects to slip through the cracks. And remember that each of these arguments must be supported with evidence from reliable sources. But to make things easier, we won't talk about the evidence for the purpose of this video. The first way to respond is to simply answer the arguments, which means you and your partner provide arguments as to why some or all of argument 1 is not true. There are a couple ways to answer arguments. The first is called line by line, which simply means that for every argument they make, you have one or more responses. Here's how that looks. In response to subpoint A, you might argue that the frequency of use does not correlate with the appropriateness of the method. In response to subpoint B, you might say that the number of arrests does not make it constitutional, and 2, many more arrests have been made with warrants, and 3, cross-apply your argument from subpoint A. The constitutionality of a law is more important than the effectiveness of the law. See what we did there? When we cross-apply an argument, it's like copying and pasting an argument from one part of the debate to the other. And since we should be reading evidence to support each point, cross-applying means you don't have to reread that evidence all over again, but you still want to remind the judge what that argument said. And in response to argument C, you might argue that requiring a warrant is our founding fathers' way of ensuring due process. Pretty important. Remember that we call this type of answering line by line, which means that for each subpoint they make, we had one or more responses. We cross-applied at least one of our arguments to save ourselves some time. But what if we needed to save ourselves a lot of time? Well, we could group their arguments. This is another form of line by line. Did you notice that our arguments to subpoints A and B were kind of similar? Since they are, instead of repeating similar arguments for 2 or more subpoints, we could just say, let's group subpoint A and B, and we'll have 3 responses. First, the Constitution matters more than crime fighting. Second, more suspects have been caught using properly issued warrants in the country than without. And third, there are good reasons why warrants are needed. Let's move on to C, where we'll have 2 responses. First, the use of warrants is more likely to ensure conviction. And second, the use of warrants is necessary to combat unchecked abuse by law enforcement. Now, that covers how to answer an argument. You can use line by line to answer each part of an argument, and you can use cross-applying and grouping to make your responses more efficient. There's still a few more ways to answer an argument. The next way is to pull an argument. This simply means copying and pasting your own argument from your or your partner's previous speeches. This is not really an effective strategy for an argument that you want to win because you don't develop it or add to the argument. Even if the other team dropped the argument, you still want to say something about your original argument to increase its value in the round. Extending an argument is a much better option. Rather than simply saying, pull my previous arguments, you want to spend at least a few seconds pointing out why your previous arguments still stand, why the argument matters, or why your opponent's arguments aren't good enough. In other words, you take the original argument and you make it even a little bit better. The final type of response is among any debater's favorite, the turn. A turn allows you to take an argument presented by the opposing team and spin it around so it works in your favor. Turns can be tricky, so let's take one easy example. Your affirmative plan is to ban warrantless wiretaps. Let's say that the negative team argues that this results in an increase in paperwork for the courts and the police. Now here comes the fun part. A turn is like saying that your opponent's argument is a good thing. So, for example, an increase in paperwork for courts and the police ensures greater oversights and results in a higher conviction rate. If you could prove that requiring warrants increases the conviction rate because of the paperwork, you could prove that the negative argument actually helps support the affirmative plan, and thus you turn the negative argument into an affirmative argument. At this point, the negative team either has to kick their own argument or disprove the turn. In other words, prove that you're wrong about the paperwork. So to review, those are the many ways to respond to an argument. Make sure you take the time to learn the difference between each of them, which ones are good or bad, and how each of them works in the round. Let's review our major terms. Drop, kick, answer, line by line, cross-applying, grouping, extending, pulling, and turn. Remember, this is so important. Every argument needs some sort of response, and the more efficient you are and the more efficient your partner is, the more responses you can make. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.